Hey guys, it's Kemi and my review for The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. And this, of course, again, centers on the Warrens, as it usually does. They are tasked to form a new case, but things are getting a bit more complicated. We see they're getting a bit more wrapped up into what's going on, and when they start to realize that this case that they thought they solved is actually a lot more complex. And so when a new case arrives is in the form of this guy, Arnie, who has murdered this one person in cold blood. Basically, the Warrens are tasked to prove whether or not this is an actual murder or if it was the work of a demonic possession, but also subsequently find out what this demon is really all about. So The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, overall, I was definitely looking forward to this movie. I mean, look, the Conjuring franchise is one that definitely is, I think, a very mixed one. You know, most of the time when it's a Conjuring film, it's really good. You know, I think that that's definitely been the most consistent of the series or any of the regular Conjuring films, but the spin-offs are always, you know, pretty much can go either way. Sometimes they can be really good, sometimes they can be really dumb. Sometimes they can be the Curse of La Llorona, where I debate whether or not it should even be considered in the franchise. But, you know, either way, they're films that I do still have interest for because I never really know how they're going to turn out. This one, I was overall conflicted with, knowing that James Wan was not returning to it, but I still kept an open mind because, like I said, I am a fan of these films. I especially enjoy the first two a lot. I've rewatched them a ton. The second one is one of my favorite horror sequels of all time, and that really has not changed at all. I rewatched both of them prior to seeing this movie, and after seeing the third one, I will say this is definitely still a very effective final film for the Conjuring universe. Is, I think, the weakest of the three, though. I think that there's a lot of things that do work very well. I think it's still a very effective horror film overall. It's just not quite on the same level as the first two, but we are just getting into right now, starting off with the cast. And I'll just say right now, if the cast wasn't as good in this movie as they really are, I don't think this film works really at all. I mean, really everyone does a great job in terms of acting, but it has to be said, unsurprisingly, the glue that holds this film together is the combined effort of Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, who of course play Ed and Lorraine, and still just do such an excellent job of doing so. Not only are you just so invested in what they're doing as characters, but they still find ways to channel new depths for these characters. I think Ed especially, you know, he's not as powerful as he's been in some of the other films. There's a bit more going on with him where he feels a bit more weakened, and so Lorraine really has to be the one to step up and take over this case, and that gives Farmiga a chance to really show just how great she is in this role. I do still think The Conjuring 2 is her overall best performance of the three, but I think this is probably her most impressive because a lot of the film really is kind of on her shoulders, both of their shoulders, honestly. This really is their movie, and they completely anchor the film. They have pitch-perfect chemistry as always. You find you're constantly rooting for them, and again, they're pouring their heart and soul into these performances, and it really makes the film something special. Even when the film is not hitting as hard as some of the other Conjuring entries, Farmiga and Wilson still find a way to invest you, still find a way to really make these characters work, and truly just do such a commendable job at playing these two. And it's one of those things that I am gonna miss. You know, I hear this is probably the last Conjuring film, and it's kind of a shame because I think that they have given such standout performances throughout all three of these films, but thank God that they still are just as good. You know, they could easily have half-assed their work at this point, but no, they are still giving it 100%, and it's very impressive to see, and like I said, they really just carry this entire film overall. But I do have to say, the rest of the cast also does do a really good job. Rory O'Connor is very good as the character of Arnie because he's someone that, you know, you're not as familiar with him, but you're very compelled by his character. What's going on with him is a lot more complex than what we've seen from some of the other characters that have been, you know, possessed by a demon. There's a lot more going on with Arnie than that, and O'Connor does a really good job of just showing how terrified he is, but also giving this performance that at times is really terrifying you, because you generally don't know what's going on with him throughout a good majority of this film, and I think he does a really good job with his performance overall. I liked the work that he ended up doing here. Definitely one of the best parts of this movie for sure. I really enjoyed his performance in the film, as well as Sarah Catherine Hook. I thought she did a really good job at playing the character of Debbie. This is Arnie's fiance in the film, and you can see how concerned she is and how much she really wants to make sure that they can get out of this without a hitch and that Arnie is back to normal in no time. But you can also see the love that she really does have for him, and I think she overall did do a really good job. Their chemistry is really good in this film. You really do buy into it, and so I think that they both worked very well together. John Noble as well was a big standout for me. He's not in this film a lot, but he was in a little bit more than I expected. I expected him to be in like one scene, and that was kind of it, but he actually has a bit more of a personal stakes within this case, and when you realize, and you know, it really gives Noble a chance to really pour out an emotional performance, and I really liked what he ended up doing here. Julian Hilliard was really good. Really, the entire cast, all of the acting, I think, is very strong in this film. Similar to the first two films, everyone does do a really good job, and that's definitely one of the best elements within this film. Alright, so now let's get to the directing and the writing, because obviously, going into this film, I think that's going to be the biggest red flag for a lot of people. Obviously, you'll notice that this film, the biggest thing about it that differentiates it from the first two is that James Wan has zero involvement, really, with this film. I think he's still a producer. I'm not sure about that, but he's no longer directing it. And look, going into this film, that is something I was really worried about. I was like, ugh, James Wan, he does such a great job, and I think he has such a specific style, too. But the thing that makes James Wan so special is that all of his films feel very refined. You can tell that he's someone that is very careful with what he does. It's very meticulously directed. So putting in the hands of someone like a Michael Chaves was something that I was a little bit worried about, because of the fact that I wasn't a fan of the previous film that he directed, The Curse of La Llorona. I didn't really know if he had it in him, but I do have to say, I think his directing is a lot better here for sure. What he does a really good job with is that he does have his own style. Yes, the film does lean into the horror aspect, but I think this is the film that leans into it the least. This is much more of a crime drama, an investigative sort of crime drama, and I think it works very well as that. He really does a good job, I think, of leaning into the paranormal itself and really trying to make this more of a mystery than anything. And I think by having that approach, it actually makes the film feel a little bit more fresh than it has in the past, because it's one of those things where he could have easily just recycled everything that Wan did, but he doesn't. He has his own sort of style to it that does hint at, I think, a more promising future for Chaves than I really did expect. And that's something that I was overall very impressed by. I was like, okay, I've actually misjudged him a bit. I think he does have a bit more talent than I've given him credit for, and I honestly would love to see what more he does, because I do think he has a genuine future within horror. The type of style that he has, again, it's one that isn't necessarily as, again, I think noticeable as Wan's, but he definitely does have talent in him, and I think he showcases it very well here overall. So I was overall a big fan of his directing. Like I said, it's not as much of a horror film, but when the horror is there, it's definitely scary. There were quite a few moments in this film that definitely had me on the edge of my seat, that definitely had me very riveted on what was going on in it. And that really is credit to Chaves' directing being as strong as it is for, it, you know, again, investing me the whole way through. But let's get into the screenplay here, because this is another element of the film that I think is going to bother some people. Again, James Wan is not attached to it at all. He was very much involved, and he had a specific writing team as well. They're not attached to it either. It's completely new writers. I think the screenplay, for the most part, is a really good one. What I really do appreciate about The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It is that it's a very different film than the first two. While the first two were very much these family dramas that also were these, you know, paranormal horror films, this one is much more of, like I said, an investigative drama, even a mystery at points. And I thought that was a really interesting way to go about this film, but I think the other thing that's really interesting about it is that while Ed and Lorraine Warren have played a major role in all of them, this really is their movie. I mean, they are front and center throughout the entire thing. There's rarely a scene goes by that they're not in some capacity, and so it gives the film a bit more of an intimate feeling when it comes to these two. We actually get to dive a little bit deeper into their relationship than we have in the past. We even get to see some flashbacks of Ed and Lorraine, you know, before they were in this paranormal, before they were paranormal investigators, them, you know, them just, you know, how they met and things like that. And again, it seems a little bit corny when I'm telling you that, but I think it adds a hidden layer to their relationship that makes us care that much more overall. If you weren't already so just over the, you know, if you weren't already so overcome and just so, head over heels in love with the relationship that Ed and Lorraine have, I think you definitely will by the end of this movie. It's just the relationship they have, it's a very sweet one, it's a very genuine one, and I think they do a really good job with that. So Ed and Lorraine as characters, you know, they're what keep me so invested in this film, but also that I think this is probably the most personal stakes they've had in the film yet, especially for Ed. I mean, what this demon is doing to him, it's physically hurting him and weakening him in a way that we really haven't seen before. The effect that it's having on him as a character, I think, is one that is very interesting, but it also is having a profound effect on Lorraine because it's sort of trying to lure her in. She has a connection to this demon that we haven't really seen before either, and I thought that was a really interesting thing to do because, again, it really invests you in their relationship. You don't really know if this is going to work out for them. You don't know if they're going to be able to fully stop this this demon. And once you find out more of what it's actually doing, I thought it was a really interesting and unique approach, and it really showed what else you can do, you know, with this type of story, because the way that the demon or antagonist of this film is operating is much different than what we've seen in the first two films. And again, I don't want to get into it too much, but there's a lot of things they do here that are decidedly different from the first two films, and I can't help but applaud them for that, because I feel like, again, they could have easily gone a very derivative direction, but they really don't. They keep finding interesting and new things to do when it comes to the demon in the film, and I think they do a really good job with that here overall. So I think for the most part, the screenplay is still a really interesting one, and they still find ways to keep me invested in no matter what's going on. Now, that being said, while there is a lot of things about this film that really do work in terms of the story, I do think this is easily the weakest story we've had yet, because while the film does do a really good job of investing you in Ed and Lorraine, unlike the other films where they really took their time to get you invested into the victims of this ghost or this spirit or whatever is really haunting them, they don't really do that here. At first, they do. They do a pretty good job of setting up, you know, what's really going on, what's at stake. The opening scene of this film is fantastic. I mean, it is such a thrill ride. You don't really know what's going to happen. It kind of just throws you into the middle of things, but it's really good because it almost feels like this would be the typical climax of Conjuring films, but because they're turning it on its head a bit, it starts off here, and so immediately you're just so interested in what's really going on when it comes to this family and how it's affecting them. But after a certain point, once we get past the actual court case of what Arnie is going through, which they really don't dive that much into, we don't really get to see a lot of these two characters and what they're going through and really giving us a reason to overall care. So that definitely did hold the film back for me, because it's not like I didn't like Arnie and his girlfriend Debbie, but I just didn't feel there was enough of a reason to really invest in them. I felt like there was a lot of time that could have been spent in getting us to care about them. Maybe draw a parallel to that of Ed and Lorraine's relationship. I feel like that's what they were trying to do here, but they don't really do that a lot. With Arnie, you know, once we realize what's going on with him, it does start to get a bit repetitive. It feels like they're kind of doing the same thing, you know, with him and what this presence is really trying to get him to overall do. It just starts to feel a bit repetitive in that way. And then with Debbie, we really don't know a lot about her. You know, we know at first what's going on, and we know that she cares about Arnie. We know that she wants to do what she can to make sure that he is over this. And we also know that his brother, David, has a very personal stakes within this whole thing. You know, he is very much a big part of this film in the first half, but again, they just didn't do enough with either of those characters. So I think that's what brings this film down in terms of the story for me. I think those characters just fall a little bit flat overall, and I think that was definitely kind of disappointing, because looking back at those first two Conjurings, yeah, Ed and Lorraine are great, but I'm just as invested in them as I am in the actual family. The actual family that this is affecting, I think it's even more important to establish, because you have to have that much more of a reason to care. And it's not like we don't, because like I said, the Warrens are very much tied to what's going on. This is probably the most personal a case they've solved yet. But when it comes to the other characters, you just don't really find yourself caring as much. John Noble's character, on the other hand, that's someone I did find myself caring about. He is this ex-priest of sorts, and you can tell that there's something more going on with him. He clearly has a lot of information about what is really going on, and when you start to find out more of what's going on with him, he actually became one of the more interesting characters, and I wish they gave Arnie and Debbie just as much as they did to John Noble, because I found his character to be a very intriguing one. His character was one that I really did want to know more about. I did want to follow. I did find myself very invested in what was going on. Again, I just couldn't say the same for Arnie and Debbie, unfortunately. So I think that's what does bring this film down. But I do think overall the screenplay is very good. The different things that this demon is doing, when you start to realize, you know, what this presence really is about, it's very fascinating stuff, and I really do applaud them for going in a different direction overall. So I do think that the screenplay is still overall really good here. The cinematography in this film also, I think, is really good. Something that stands out a lot about this film is that we do get a lot more of a chance to go off to different locations, and because of that, I think they really do make the most out of them. The opening scene, like I said, is fantastic. The effects work that they do, I mean, it's great, and they really do a great job of putting you into this environment. But I think throughout the entire film, you know, you really do feel this eerie sense going on, because you know what happened in that first scene, especially when it comes to the Warrens. You know what happened, and so you're constantly worried that it's going to happen again, and that very much applies with the cinematography in this film. There's a scene in a morgue especially. Oh my god, I mean, that scene really sticks out in terms of aesthetic, in terms of what they're really going for. I think the cinematography is still a really good element of this film overall. Again, I do think it's not quite as refined as the first two films, but I think there's still a lot of really memorable shots here that are definitely, you know, weeks after seeing the movie, I'm still very much thinking about. So I do think the cinematography is still a really great element in this film. And like I said, while this film I wouldn't say is as much of a horror film as the first two, there's definitely still a lot of moments that had me on the edge of my seat. I mean, I already talked about the morgue scene and how I think that is all very well handled. The opening sequence of this film is really great. There's a lot of sequences here that definitely had me on edge, and I think are overall very well filmed. And what I like about is that, yeah, there are jump scares, but they're not false scares. They're definitely moments that had me quite unsettled, and I do really appreciate the film for doing that, because again, I think there have been a lot of Conjuring entries that have not really scared me very much at all, and I can't really say that about this one. There were a lot of moments that had me on edge, and I do really appreciate them for doing that. I think the sound design is a big component of that. The sound design is really good here. It's one that really does suck you into everything, and I think they do a really good job with that overall. The score, as always, is really great. I think throughout all three of these films, I think that Joseph Bishara, he's always had a really good musical score. He finds a way to make you very horrified, but again, also invest you in what's going on. I think he really just kind of like adds to the intensity of this film, and I really enjoyed his score here. And the editing, this is the shortest Conjuring film so far, and I will say I do think it could have been a little bit longer. I think if they would have added an additional 20 minutes, literally they just need to add 20 minutes, I think some of the things that I had an issue with could have been improved upon. I think that would have made the film that much better overall, and I won't lie, the second act of this film I do think runs a little bit too long. There's a point in this movie where, you know, it feels like they are kind of stalling and they're trying hard to get the information, but the problem with that is that it feels like for a while there isn't a lot going on in this movie, and eventually, like I said, it does pick up, but I do think that the second act is just a little bit too slow for my liking. But I will say, I never found myself bored with this movie. I was still pretty much invested the entire time. I was constantly, you know, wondering to see what was going to happen, and the way they wrap things up overall, if this really is the last Conjuring, I don't think it's a bad way to go out. I do still think that it's a pretty satisfying entry. My only other flaw with this movie is the actual case itself. We really don't get a lot of time to invest in it. The trailers kind of hint at this being like a courtroom drama, and it's really not. Maybe for like a couple scenes, we see that, you know, the judge and some of the other people in the courtroom are sort of debating whether or not this is a legitimate thing. You know, is this something where he could have been possessed by the devil? Is this an actual thing? But very quickly, we move past that, and the film focuses much more on the story it's trying to tell, and I just wish that it would have maybe dived a bit more into the courtroom drama aspect, because not only would it have been something different, but it also would have given us that tether to Arnie and Debbie that I feel like the film was very much missing. Again, I think that the actors were really good, and I liked their characters, but I didn't feel emotionally attached to them in the way that I did the other families in the previous films, and so I do think that was missing overall. Look, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, yes, it definitely is the weakest of the three films we've had so far, but it still has a lot of the hallmarks of what has made this franchise really good. It's got two stand-up performances from Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, and in Lorraine as characters, I think have truly never been better. They add something to this film that I think that they didn't even have in the first two. There's the stakes in here are a lot more personal for them. They still are finding new and exciting ways to do things with the threat itself. The threat in this movie, it's really unlike anything we've seen before, and I found it to be very interesting with what they did. It trades in some of the more traditional like haunted house aspects for much more of a investigative paranormal thriller that I do think overall works very well. I do think it falls a bit flat in terms of some of the other characters that aren't Ed and Lorraine, but overall I think for what this film is, I do think it still does work. Yes, you definitely do feel the absence of James Wan, but I think Michael Chaves does just enough to keep you invested, to present something that's a little bit different from what we've seen before, and you know what, I definitely, again, am here for that. I would much rather a franchise do something different than just retain everything and just regurgitate all of the things that it's done before. This really is a film that is trying to be something different, and it is trying to end The Conjuring on a much different note than you would have expected it to. Like I said, there are some aspects that I do think the film glosses over, and I wish they would have gotten into more, but overall, I definitely was pretty entertained by this film, so I am going to give The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, overall, a B. But over, guys, in my review, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Let me know what you guys saw this movie overall, left your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.